What if the most powerful person in a country isn't the one giving speeches from a podium, but the one who never steps in front of a camera at all? In the 1990s, as Russia clawed its way out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, entire industries were being sold for fractions of their value. Oil fields, aluminum plants, television networks. Fortunes were made in conference rooms thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. Among the men moving fastest through that chaos was Boris Berezovsky, a mathematician turned car dealer turned oligarch, a man who understood that in a collapsing empire, power doesn't disappear, it simply changes hands. He didn't look like a kingmaker, no military uniform, no political office, but he had something far more valuable: access. Through a web of companies and partnerships, Berezovsky acquired stakes in Russia's most lucrative assets, including oil giant Sibneft and, more importantly, one of the country's largest television channels, ORT. In a nation where millions relied on television as their primary source of truth, controlling a network wasn't about entertainment. It was about narrative, and narrative in a fragile democracy is oxygen. By the mid-1990s, Russia's first post-Soviet president, Boris Yeltsin, was bleeding support. The economy was in free fall. Inflation devoured savings. Crime syndicates flourished. And in the polls, a communist resurgence loomed. For the oligarchs who had grown rich in the privatization frenzy, a communist victory threatened everything. Factories could be renationalized, assets seized, fortunes erased overnight. Berezovsky saw the storm coming, and he decided to shape it. Inside boardrooms and private apartments, a small circle of businessmen began coordinating strategy. They would use their media empires not just to report on politics, but to steer it. Nightly news segments framed Yeltsin as flawed but necessary. His opponents were painted as dangerous relics of the past. Carefully crafted stories amplified fear. Fear of returning to Soviet repression, fear of losing newfound freedoms, fear of economic collapse. The messaging was relentless, synchronized, precise. Yeltsin's approval ratings, once in the single digits, began to rise. Campaign ads flooded the airwaves. Pop concerts doubled as political rallies. The line between entertainment and propaganda blurred. Behind the scenes, oligarch money fueled operations that the state itself couldn't afford. Consultants were hired, strategies refined. It was politics engineered like a hostile takeover. When Yeltsin won re-election in 1996 against staggering odds, many credited a miraculous comeback. But in private, insiders understood the mechanics. A handful of businessmen had mobilized the country's information arteries to produce a desired outcome. Berezovsky emerged from the campaign not merely wealthy, but indispensable. He was appointed to a senior position in the Security Council. Officially, he was an advisor. Unofficially, he was part of the circuitry connecting business and the Kremlin. From there, influence expanded outward. Legislation affecting energy exports mysteriously aligned with the interests of certain companies. Regulatory decisions favored familiar names. Media critics found themselves sidelined or discredited. Television anchors who strayed too far from approved narratives were replaced. Power was never declared. It was exercised quietly, through appointments, through funding, through the invisible pressure points that make institutions bend. But control built on chaos has an expiration date. As Yeltsin's health deteriorated and his presidency weakened, a question hung over Moscow. Who would inherit the throne? For Berezovsky and his circle, The next leader had to be manageable, someone who would protect the oligarchic system they had helped cement. Their eyes settled on a relatively unknown former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Disciplined, loyal, uncharismatic enough, they believed, to remain dependent on those who elevated him. Television once again went to work. Putin was introduced to the public as steady, decisive, a contrast to Yeltsin's erratic image. When apartment bombings shook Russia in 1999, fear gripped the nation. Putin, newly appointed prime minister, promised order. Military action in Chechnya was broadcast with patriotic fervor. Ratings surged, his profile rose. By the time Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned on New Year's Eve, naming Putin acting president, the transition felt almost inevitable. The kingmakers had chosen their king. At first, the arrangement appeared to hold. Putin secured election in 2000. The oligarchs expected continuity, influence behind the curtain. But something subtle shifted. Unlike his predecessor, Putin did not seem content sharing power with businessmen. He began consolidating authority, tightening control over regional governors, security services, and, critically, media outlets. The same networks that once shaped elections were now targets. Independent channels faced legal and financial pressure. Ownership structures were scrutinized. State-aligned entities acquired stakes. The message was clear. Influence would flow in one direction now, toward the Kremlin. Berezovsky resisted. He used his media platforms to criticize the new administration, accusing it of authoritarian drift. The response was swift. Prosecutors opened investigations into his business dealings. Charges of fraud and embezzlement mounted. Allies distanced themselves. Assets were seized. The billionaire, who had once orchestrated political survival, found himself politically exposed. He fled Russia, first to France, then to the United Kingdom, where he received asylum. From London, he continued attacking the Kremlin, funding opposition figures, granting interviews that painted Putin as a threat to democracy. But distance erodes leverage. In Russia, his name became synonymous with the excesses of the 1990s. Corruption, oligarchic manipulation, a symbol of a chaotic era many citizens wanted to forget. Back home, the system he had helped construct was being re-engineered without him. Media consolidation accelerated. Political competition narrowed. Laws tightened around dissent. The architecture of influence remained. Centralized media, strategic narratives, economic leverage, but control had migrated upward. The man who once pulled strings was now outside the theater. In exile, Berezovsky's fortune dwindled. Legal battles drained resources. Former partners turned rivals. In 2013, he was found dead in his Berkshire home under circumstances officially ruled as suicide. The mathematician who had calculated political outcomes, who had navigated the volatility of post-Soviet Russia like a grandmaster, died alone, far from the corridors he once influenced. Yet the blueprint he operated within never vanished. The idea that power could be exercised not only through ballots and laws, but through ownership of networks, of narratives, of economic lifelines, proved enduring. The 1990s had revealed how fragile institutions could be when money and media intertwined, and it showed how quickly the balance between public office and private wealth could blur. For a brief, volatile chapter in Russian history, a businessman without a formal mandate helped determine who governed a nuclear superpower. He didn't command armies. He commanded airtime. He didn't draft constitutions. He influenced the stories people believed about them. In a country searching for stability, he discovered that the most decisive battles weren't fought in parliament or on the streets, but in living rooms flickering with televised truth. And in the end, the system he helped empower evolved beyond him, a reminder that when influence operates in the shadows, it can just as easily consume the hand that once controlled it.